we're here in part because Dr. Seddon has just written a book, Go for Orbit, about her career as an astronaut and some aspects of her life beyond the astronaut corps. And Captain Gibson is giving a lecture here at the museum tonight. And so they were both very generous in agreeing to come in and talk with us this morning. So again, we're delighted to have you all here.
Thank you.
And perhaps we might start with a little bit of background. Who were you? What were you like when you were the age of these students? What were your interests, your activities?
Well, you know, I was a typical kid growing up in a really small town in Tennessee, and thought that, you know, people didn't go anywhere from my little town. And one night I went out and looked up at the sky, and my father pointed out Sputnik. And that was the first satellite that had gone into space. And it was put there by the Russians. And he said something very important to me. He said, "You are watching the beginning of a new era. It's called the space age." And you know, that made a real impression on me. But you know, I had a lot of growing up to do before I could ever become involved in something like that. Hoot's background is very different from mine.
Well, certainly, yeah. I grew up mostly in Southern California in the Los Angeles area, so definitely not a small town, pretty big town. Kind of typical California boy into surfing, but really big time model airplane building. Been building model airplanes my entire life, flying models primarily. Back then, rubber band powered, and Mom and Dad were both pilots. In fact, that's how they met, very much like Ray and I. My mom was learning how to fly, and my dad was a flight instructor. So I grew up with aviation literally from the time I was an infant. And so had been flying my entire life. And that's what steered me in the direction that I wound up going and making my way into the space program as well.
At what point did each of you begin to have a sense that you wanted to be an astronaut? Obviously, you wanted to fly your whole life, but when did flying in air become flying in space?
I have a little different story from most of the astronauts. I know many of the astronauts, you ask them, they'll tell you they wanted to be an astronaut their entire life. I wanted to be a pilot. I'm an airplane person. Airplanes have wings. The Mercury, the Gemini, the Apollo, they didn't have wings. They were what I called capsules. Mm-hmm. And so I was fascinated by it, but I wasn't interested in doing it myself. And when I first got the bug I remember I was reading a magazine, Aviation Week magazine, and in this magazine was an artist's concept of what a space shuttle was going to look like coming back from space. And this was in the early 70s. We had committed to building a space shuttle. And I saw that and the line from Independence Day. Oh man, I have got to get me one of these. I remember looking at a space shuttle and saying, I really want to fly that. So kind of a big change of direction for me.
And at that time, you were just out of high school, probably. Out of high school, out of college?
Oh no, I was in the Navy as a fighter pilot. I was a fighter pilot in the Navy at that point.
Doing carrier landings?
Doing carrier landings, and wanted to go to test pilot school because that had been one of my goals my entire life, was to be a test pilot. And then when space shuttles came along, I knew if I wanted to be a space shuttle pilot, I needed to be a test pilot as well. So that part of it wasn't much of a change of direction, but the fact was, man, I really wanted to fly space shuttles.
And Dr. Seddon, when did the idea dawn on you that astronautics might be your career path?
You know, when I was that little girl looking up at Sputnik, I thought, I wonder if I could ever become part of the space age. But of course, back then, people hadn't even flown in space, but we were seeing this show called Buck Rogers on television. Some of us from back then remember it, but it was about a guy that would launch in a rocket and go into space. And so we had the feeling that people would eventually get to go into space. But then when I began to see people flying in space, they didn't look like me. They were men, and they were all test pilots. And you had to be at least 5'6" tall. Well, I was going to grow all I could, but I never reached 5'6". So it didn't seem like a very realistic sort of thing for me. But as quickly as the space program was developing, we had people landing on the moon, we had a space station as I was growing up, and it was called Skylab. And I thought, well, maybe someday they'll have a space station up there and they'll need doctors. And that's really what I kind of wanted to do in my life, was to become a doctor. And so I thought maybe I could combine both of those careers. And some sort of interesting things happened to me as I was training to be a doctor. I met a doctor who owned a flying school, and he invited me out to take flying lessons. And I thought, well, you know, maybe someday I'll be a rich doctor and I'll own my own airplane. But if I get to be an astronaut, or to apply to be an astronaut, maybe having some flying experience would be a good thing to do. So as my life went on, suddenly things began to happen to me that I thought, maybe this is what I was supposed to do. And just as I was finishing my medical training, NASA announced they were going to choose a new class of astronauts, 35 astronauts to fly on the space shuttle. And they were, for the first time, going to take non-pilots, and they were going to take women. And so, you know, when you've sort of had something in your mind for a long time, and this is a dream that you've always had, you have to go for it. I didn't think I'd get in, but I could fill out an application and try. And so I tried, and lo and behold, I got in.
And that was extraordinary, because in that recruitment for astronauts for the space shuttle, there were at least 8,000 applications. And Dr. Seddon and Captain Gibson were selected their first time into this group of 35, which included 15 pilots and 20 engineers and scientists. And the space shuttle could carry enough people that it only really needed 2 pilots aboard, but everybody else could be a scientist or an engineer, a medical doctor, a veterinarian. So this opened up a lot of opportunities for people who were not pilots, and also for women, African Americans, Hispanics, and others who had not been eligible in the 1960s. Right. So you all were called a new breed of astronaut, and this was a new era of spaceflight. What was it like to be in on the ground floor of that? And particularly when there were still some of the older astronauts from the 1960s in the Corps. Did they welcome you all with open arms? Were they a little skeptical about you? Was it different if you were a pilot or a scientist?
I saw open arms is what I saw. They probably numbered about 25 or 30 of the older astronauts who had been there. And this was the first time we had selected astronauts in 9 years. This was 1978, and the previous selection had been 1969. So it was met with an awful lot of excitement, both in the press and in the nation as a whole, because we just had not picked astronauts, like I say, for 9 years. So it was an exciting time, and we were really excited to be getting in on the, I'll say, the ground floor of the space shuttle program. And
a new vehicle, a new style of flight.
A whole entirely different way of flying in space. Yes, absolutely.
How about you? Was it different being a woman? Obviously, it was a novelty to have women in the astronaut corps for the first time. Did the older astronauts welcome the women with open arms, or were they a little skeptical?
Well, they appeared to, and it was only later on that we heard that maybe there was some rumbling about, you know, women in the office. I mean, Hoot fit the mold. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and so he was like the older astronauts pretty much. But those of us who came in as scientists, I can only imagine what the older guys were thinking as we came into the room for our first meeting. You know, I didn't look like I was old enough to drink yet, because I'm kind of small and looked pretty young at that point in time. And we had people coming from academic situations that looked like professors at a big university. They had beards and they looked very studious. And of course, for fighter pilots and for astronauts, we looked a lot different. So I think they were a little skeptical at first, but we all had our duties as mission specialists. we came in with good credentials, as you can imagine. They had a lot of people to choose from. When there were 8,000 people out there, they chose some pretty well-educated and experienced people. So I think once we proved that we could do the work, that we were serious, that we could do things that were required of us to become astronauts, I think they accepted us very much.
And as they accepted you for your capabilities and credentials, there was a culture change in the sense that everything had been sized for men, procedures had been written for men, and women were smaller generally. I think you were too small to fit into some of the spacesuits, right?
I was the littlest astronaut at the time.
So there had to be changes. Women had long hair, and so there was some concern about how they should manage their hair when they're in space, if it floats in a big halo around their head. At the time, I think you entered the astronaut corps, there wasn't a locker room for women in the astronaut gym.
Right, exactly.
So
they
NASA had
that.
to adjust. NASA had to adjust,
They did.
just as individuals had to adjust. Well, if I can ask you a little bit more personal question, if it's not too personal. You all were in the same class of astronauts. There were 35 of you. How did you start noticing each other, and what impressed you about each other that encouraged you to start dating? There had never been daters in the astronaut corps.
We both remember exactly the time that we met.
I didn't want to go first. Go ahead.
I can remember we were selected and when we received the call that we had been selected, it came out in the newspaper and we could see pictures of the people that we'd be flying on the shuttle with, but we really didn't know them. And so NASA invited us down after we were selected in January of 1978 to come down and meet each other and speak to the press and maybe look around for homes. And they had a sort of a get-together right before we all went in to have dinner or something. And I saw two people that I recognized from the pictures that were going to be in my class. And I knew that they were two pilots. Hoot was one of them. The other one was dark-haired and dark-eyed. And I thought, oh, they're kind of good-looking. And so I went over and introduced myself. And Hoot remembers that too. Would you like to tell him?
Well, yes, I remember the first time I met Ray because it stands out because it was something sort of unusual back in those days. This was the end of January 1978, and the other pilot I think she's referring to is one of the pilots that I worked with at the Navy Flight Test Center, Mike Coates, another Navy pilot. And I remember he said, "Hoot, have you met Rhea Seddon yet?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." And he said, "Ray, this is Hoot Gibson." And I was impressed because Ray held her hand out to shake my hand. And protocol back in those days was you didn't shake hands with a woman unless she offered her hand. So it was, nowadays, it's very normal. I mean, men and women shake hands all the time. But back then, the lady was to offer her hand if she felt like shaking your hand. So it was a little bit unusual, but because Ray was an MD, a doctor, and in a professional profession, she was accustomed to shaking hands and all, but I have always remembered that.
It's strange how some small things that happen in your life suddenly become kind of important later on. And you go back and you think, how did that happen? And we both remembered that occasion.
And were you two assigned together for training flights in the T-38s, or did you choose to fly together?
The T-38s are two-seater jets that NASA has, and they're for transportation for the folks that the astronauts to get from place to place. There are many NASA centers, but they were also there to help us learn how to be good crew members and work together. So the backseaters, those of us who were non-pilots, had to get flight time in the back seat of the T-38s, and so we could choose whichever pilots we wanted to fly with when planes were available. Did I get that correct?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And the pilots would teach us how to use the communication and navigation system, how to get strapped in, how to use a parachute, and then they would let us do a little bit of the flying. And by the time I left, they would let us do all the flying we wanted in those jets. If you can imagine being a doctor and not having anything more than small plane experience, to be put in the back of a jet and told that I could fly it a little bit and be trained to do that.
A supersonic jet.
Supersonic jet.
A supersonic jet. So yeah, and we would coach them, we'd help train them, and like Ray said, by the time they had been there a couple of years, they could fly those airplanes just fine. They weren't allowed to do the takeoff or the landing, but they could fly everything in between.
And that's how we got to know each other, really, flying together.
And that's the beginning of teamwork experience too, as you stated, which would certainly stand you in good stead as you integrated into a larger crew.
Sure.
Now, you two married after 3 years of your training and preparation to start flying. And as I recall, that was noted in the national media.
Yes.
Because it was a first. There were, of course, other married astronauts. And in fact, there was one couple where the wife had been admitted in the first class of astronauts, and then her husband was admitted in the second class. But this was the first couple to meet and marry within the astronaut corps. And then a few years later, when you had your first child, that also was reported in the national news as another first. Was that your first brush with celebrity, and did it give you any experience in how to handle this coming fame for being astronauts?
I think the women got a lot of attention when we first came in, and it made us feel a little uncomfortable that they were not speaking to the men too, but we were unusual. But yes, you know, as you went along in your life, you found out that a lot of people were interested, and you know, certainly when our first child was born, and I'd like to tell everybody, there's a name for children born to two astronauts. Paul, our first son, was the world's first astronaut. So he feels like he's somebody special.
Yeah.
I guess that was an indication to you also that the border between your personal life and your public life was fluid,
Yes.
that it might shift.
Definitely.
I think we're ready to take some questions, both from our online audience and our local audience. So how shall we begin? With this young woman here, would you like to step up and state your name and ask your question?
I'm Allison Dove, and was it really hard to become an astronaut? Because I want to become one, and I've heard you have to be good in math.
Well, actually, you have to be good at a lot of different things. Math is one of them. You have to have at least a college degree, and hopefully more schooling after that, perhaps an MD or PhD degree. But I think you just have to go through life and work hard and show that you're willing to work hard. And you know, sometimes subjects are hard. Math was hard for me. Physics was really hard for me. But you know, if you really have a dream and you really want to do something, I mean, you just figure out how to get through it. And sometimes you have to go back and start over. I had to take physics in college 2 times to get through it. But that's okay. It proves that you're willing to do that. Certainly you have to be in good health, so keep yourself in good health. And you know, you just have to be willing to show that, and I think right now we're selecting people with science, math, engineering, or teaching as a background.
Right.
Okay, we have an online question. What types of experiments did you conduct on the shuttle?
Well, from the pilot side of the house, I was a shuttle pilot, flew as a co-pilot on my first mission, and then flew 4 missions as the mission commander. And so some of the things that we were doing, I'll refer to as flight testing, primarily flight testing. So even when we had flown 50 space shuttle missions, we were still doing flight testing. And so some of it was orbital drag and things like that, fuel usage, and just different investigations of how the shuttle operated and how it flew. And then we had materials science as well that we were involved in, and I'll let Ray talk about some of the other sorts of science that we did.
Well, you know, also you carried telescopes, and you had to point the shuttle at certain places. So it was looking out the window. All of my experiments were inside in a laboratory, and we were looking at what happens to the human body when it goes into weightlessness. What happens when gravity is no longer there? And we wanted to know about the human body, but we also wanted to make sure that when people went into space, that they were healthy when they were in space so they could do their work, but also healthy when they came home, healthy as they got older, so there wasn't anything that happened to you that was going to affect you later on. And so we did a lot of testing of a lot of human systems, the heart, the inner ear that helps you sense gravity, what happens when there's no gravity there, the bones, does calcium come out of the bones? And it does. What about your muscles? When you don't have to walk, you can fly everywhere, your muscles get weaker. So there were a lot of things that we were finding out that we will have to figure out how to reverse that in space so you stay healthy in space. For instance, if you want to go to Mars, that may take 3 years to get there. So some very interesting things we were doing around the life sciences. Of course, a lot of different sciences that were taking place on the shuttle.
Okay, we have another question here. And your name?
My name is Alejandra, and what inspired you to become an astronaut?
What inspired you to become astronauts?
I touched on it a little bit. I had been a jet fighter pilot and a test pilot, and I was flying F-14 Tomcats, which is the airplane in the movie Top Gun, and I had graduated from Top Gun as well. But I was flying F-14 Tomcats at the time, and one of the things I remember looking at was this space shuttle is going to fly at 200 miles up, and it's going to fly at 17,000 miles an hour. That's even higher and faster than my Tomcat will fly. So I really want to fly those because it's the fastest airplane in the world. And so I wanted to fly the fastest airplane in the world. That was part of the motivation, but as well, the view from orbit, oh my gosh, it's spectacular to see the Earth from 200 miles up. Good question.
And you know, Alejandra, for me, this was something that I had thought about for a long time that I didn't think I could ever get to do. And I was just very interested in the people going into space. I mean, rockets were nice. I mean, flying things was nice. But I wanted to learn about what happens when people go up there. And it was kind of a progression of medical school, surgery, where I had to treat sick people, and then to move into something that was really different, but something that I felt like I could make a contribution to. Thank you.
And that's a nice segue into talking about your actual missions and what it was like to live and work in space, what kinds of activities you performed in space as part of your role as pilot commander or mission specialist payload commander. You were actually in charge of all the scientific activity on space shuttle missions. As part of that, I wonder, Ray, if anyone along the way during your education suggested to you that instead of medicine as a doctor, you should go into nursing, or instead of aspiring to be an astronaut, you should maybe aspire to be a flight attendant. Did you encounter any suggestions or obstacles on the way that you had to get over?
You know, this group of kids don't realize that, you know, back when I was growing up, there were certain things that ladies, I grew up in the South, so we were not women, we were ladies, certain things that ladies were supposed to do if they wanted to work outside the home, and most women didn't work outside the home. And I think I can recount when I was in college, I went over to a party, a get-together, where my family pediatrician was, and I was speaking to him, Dr. Lewis, and he asked me kindly, how are your college courses going? And I said, they're really tough because I'm pre-med, meaning I wanted to go to medical school. And he looked at me and he said, oh, Ray, you're too cute to be a doctor. You'll just drop out and just marry a doctor. So I think there were some preconceived notions back when we were growing up that girls didn't do certain things. And I think everybody will face some of that. People will tell you, well, engineering's not appropriate for girls, or guys don't go into that kind of work. But I think you have to have in your own mind what you want to do and just be strong in pursuing it.
And it is true that the Space Shuttle and the Astronaut Corps came along at the same time, that there were tremendous changes going on in our society at large, and women were beginning to open doors into professions they hadn't occupied before. And you were able then to bring that training you had persisted in getting into the shuttle. Let's start with you then, talking about your missions. You flew almost every kind of mission the Space Shuttle could fly. You did satellite deployments, you did a mission to the Mir space station, you did a laboratory mission, you did a Defense Department mission. Among those different kinds of missions, does one or another stand out to you as being more challenging or more fun? Or
They all do.
They all do. Each had its own challenge.
They all stood out in a very spectacular way, and you don't get accustomed to it. You adapt to it, of course, but every mission was spectacular, no matter what you were doing. My first mission was aboard Challenger, and as you mentioned, we launched 2 satellites into orbit, and they used their booster motors to carry themselves up even higher. We made the first landing by a space shuttle at Cape Canaveral, so we were the first mission to launch and return back to the Cape, and that was the 10th launch of a space shuttle. And then I commanded my first mission less than 2 years later, and we launched 1 satellite and did ultraviolet telescopes and things like that. And then, oh golly, I had a Department of Defense classified mission, which to this day, I can't say much about it except that we launched a major new intelligence satellite, and that's about all I'm allowed to say. And then I had 2 Spacelab missions. Now, my final mission was probably the biggest challenge of all, and that was the first docking that was ever performed by a space shuttle. And when I say docking, I mean attaching a space shuttle to a space station. And in this case, it was the Russian space station Mir. And one of the big challenges of the mission was we had to attempt to learn to speak Russian. And I say attempt because I'm an engineer. I'm pretty good with physics and math and science and those things, but languages? I are not good at languages. English, for example. I are not good at English. And so learning Russian was a bit of a challenge, but the Russians couldn't speak English, and they could not afford to buy English textbooks or hire English teachers, so we had to make the effort to learn to speak Russian, and it's a little bit of a challenging language. The alphabet's all different. There are 33 characters in the Russian alphabet, and they're Greek, Arabic, and Cyrillic. And so just the alphabet was a bit of a challenge. Here's the best sentence I know in Russian. Я говорю по-русски очень плохо и понимаю ничего. I speak Russian very badly and I understand nothing. So if I'm going to talk to somebody in Russian, I will usually start off by saying that, just so they don't expect too much out of my Russian. But what a fascinating mission it was.
Absolutely.
And in your role as commander, you are responsible not only for the safety of the vehicle and the safety of the crew, but the accomplishment of all of the objectives of the mission. Would you like to say anything about your style of leadership in melding your crew together and achieving that kind of success?
Sure, yes. And yes, as the crew commander, you're the pilot in command. So I was the one to land the space shuttle on those 4 missions when I was mission commander. So, and you're the leader of the crew. Mm-hmm. And I'm very fond of saying there is a big difference between a boss and a leader. A leader is somebody that basically says, okay, follow me guys, here we go. And we're going to do this and we're going to make it look easy. That was one of my fundamentals when I would first gather together with this crew that I had been assigned to go fly with. I would say, we're going to have fun, because if we're not having fun, we're doing something wrong. This is the neatest job in the world, to get to go to space in a space shuttle. This is the neatest job in the world. It's really going to be fun, and if we find that we're not having fun, we're doing it wrong. And so I don't believe in over-supervising people, especially smart, talented people like astronauts. I always, when I was a crew commander and then also as the chief astronaut, I held the position of chief astronaut for 2 years towards the end of our time there. I would not over-supervise people. I would tell them, here's what we need to do. And the other thing that I felt as a leader is, hey, I don't have all the answers. I do not have all the answers. So I'm looking to all of you guys to give me some of the answers and to contribute and to make this a team effort, and together we will make this work. So those are some of my philosophies on leadership.
Well, and Ray, you were a leader also on the science and engineering side, and on your missions, you served as payload commander, which is essentially all of the activity on the shuttle that doesn't have to do with managing the shuttle itself.
Right.
Would you like to talk about both the kinds of activities you managed and what your leadership style was?
Well, on my Spacelab mission, we had experiments that were proposed by scientists all over the world. So we had to learn how to operate those and also how to be the subjects for all the experiments that were proposed. And I think the thing for me that I learned in being the payload commander is that there was a lot of coordination between the crew and the engineers that were building the equipment for us, the crew and the scientists who knew what they wanted us to do, but had to teach us how to do it, and we had to work together to do that. Certainly the NASA management that wanted us to do missions in a certain way. We had to learn how to fix all the equipment, because you know the repairman can't come and fix things if they're broken. So there was a lot of coordination with other people, and I know that Hoot had to do that on his side too. So learning how to work with a lot of different people, taking everything into consideration, understanding what the priorities were, that was a real leadership challenge for me. I don't think I had ever done anything quite so broad-based than when I became payload commander.
I think it would be hard, too, to jump over fields the way you had to do, because you were trained in biology and life sciences,
Right.
but any given mission might have 100 experiments that ranged from astronomy and astrophysics to material science, materials processing, to Earth observations. You had to master all of that.
Well,
and you had to get your payload crew to master all of that.
And the scientists like to tell us, you are our eyes, our minds, and our hands in space. So there was a lot of responsibility in understanding what you were doing up there rather than just turning it on and off.
Okay, I think we're ready for some more questions, and we will start with one from online. How did NASA handle your marriage and pregnancy?
They took it
with great surprise.
Yes, a lot of surprise. But I think we knew, or were told, that we would not be able to fly together, so there was that rule. As far as being pregnant, they decided that after a certain point in my pregnancy, I couldn't fly in the NASA jets because it had an ejection seat. So there were some rules involved, but I mean, they took it in stride. I mean, if you're going to have men and women working together, they may marry and they may have families. So it worked out pretty well.
And you all were very clever about spacing your family so that your children were born between your missions.
6 or 7 years apart.
Right. Okay, let's take a question here from the live audience, and your name is?
My name is Princess, and my question is, how much training do you have to do to become an astronaut?
How much training? You want to answer that?
Oh, golly, yes, a lot.
A lot.
The answer is a lot. And in fact, there was so much training that one of the jokes we used to tell was, as you were getting closer and closer to flight, you were involved in training for 60 and 70 hours per week is how much training you'd be doing. And we used to refer to it as death by training, just as a joke. But yes, it was really intense, and you would train for an entire year on one mission. So you got assigned to your mission a year before, and you train for an entire year. Good question.
Thank you.
Good question.
Okay, and your question is?
Hi, my name is Kayla. Did you ever feel sick floating around in space?
Did you ever feel sick?
Sick. You know, there's something that at first we called space motion sickness, and we found that on the shuttle, about 2/3 of the people felt like they had an upset stomach and felt kind of seasick when they first got to space. And we didn't exactly know what that was, but we sort of figured out it wasn't necessarily due to the motion, but we still weren't very sure what was causing it. It was interesting on my first flight, there were 7 of us. There was an engineer, an astronomer, me, a doctor, and the other guys were all pilots. They had flown a lot. They had never been motion sick. And there is justice in the world, because when we got to space, the pilots didn't feel so good, and the 2 scientists on board felt fine. We kept looking at each other and saying, "Are we sick yet? Are we sick yet?" So some people did, some people didn't. We found that you can give people a shot that kind of fixes it, so we don't have to worry so much about it anymore. But I was very lucky that I wasn't one of the people that felt sick.
We were both
Yeah.
2 of the lucky ones that didn't get sick
Absolutely.
in space.
Absolutely.
So yeah, good question.
And we have another online question. Will commercial space flight lead to a civilian astronaut training program? What do you think?
Well, it certainly will. And the commercial space flight, where you're going to be able to pay your way to go to space, won't be managed by NASA, and it won't be managed by the government. And so it's going to be a devoted crew that is trained by the contractor that's doing those. So there will be civilian astronauts that are not of NASA, because you need, obviously, trained astronauts to operate your vehicle, whatever kind of vehicle that winds up being. So there will be.
Do you think it will be more like airline operations, and people will be wanting to go into space as tourists to enjoy the view and maybe eventually go to a space station or a space hotel?
Absolutely, and in fact, Sir Richard Branson is building Spaceship Two with that in mind, to be able to carry people up to the edge of space, actually in space, over 100 kilometers of altitude, on a relatively short flight, but that's going to proceed. He is dedicated to doing it, and so it's going to go forward.
That's really just over the horizon. Okay, let's take another question here.
Hi, my name's Julia Kinzer, and my question is, how do you brush your teeth while you're in space?
Good practical question. Well, obviously you can't spit out the toothpaste. So we have toothpaste that we pretty much swallow. But but you can brush your teeth, and if you don't feel like swallowing it, you can spit it into a washcloth. But you know, that's just one of those little things that you get told what people do before you go, and you sort of think you know what it's going to be like, and sometimes you get surprises. You know, you brush your teeth and all of a sudden there's toothpaste flying around because you were brushing too vigorously, and it's weightlessness. But that, and learning to sleep in space and to eat meals in space and how to move around in space, you really can't learn that until you get there. But people, you know, that have flown pass along little hints to help you, but you have to kind of figure it out when you get there.
So the answer is, the easiest thing is just to swallow your
swallow the
toothpaste, Julie.
toothpaste.
And I mean, it sounds gross, but there's nothing wrong with it.
No.
It's fine.
Oh, thank you for these questions. We'll have one more round of questions in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about being a 2-astronaut family, a 4-children family. You all didn't fly at the same times, but you might fly a mission. Hoot would be in training for a mission, he would fly, then you would be in training and you would fly. So you must have been away from your family a lot. And your children must have had some reactions to having absent parents or parents who are in very demanding careers. Do you want to share any lessons you learned about family life when those are the circumstances in which the family is growing up?
Well, we did take turns flying, and NASA would not have put a married couple together on a flight purposely, although we wound up having a couple. My fourth mission, I was commander of a flight where two of the astronauts were not married when they started training together, but they became very fond of each other and they wound up marrying and then flew in space, but they didn't have any children. Mm-hmm. We would not put a husband and wife on a space shuttle or a space vehicle of any kind. There's just too much risk that you could leave children orphans. So you just would not do that. So Ray and I, we had a bet as to who was going to go first. She was betting I would, I was betting she would. It wound up being me. I flew in 1984. Then Ray flew in 1985. I flew in 1986. And then we had the Challenger accident. So then I flew in 88, she flew in 91, I flew in 92, she flew in 93, and then I flew in 1995. So we took turns. So one parent was generally at home and around the kids while the other person would be training or actually in space.
But really the answer for us was getting help. You know, when you have that kind of crazy life and you both have careers, you need somebody to help you, and we found a wonderful nanny who came and lived with us and stayed with us, if you can believe it, for 25 years. So she was wonderful and she was there. But you know, I think our kids knew that we loved them and we would be there for them. And we did all the usual family vacations and things like that, and would take time off after flights, and all the craziness had slowed down. But we lived in a community where everybody was doing that. We lived all around the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and there were lots of astronauts and engineers who had crazy jobs like we did. And you know, they went to school with people that, you know, okay, so-and-so's, you know, father's going to fly, so-and-so's mother's going to fly. I don't think they thought it was odd. That was just the way life was. That was their world. It was only later that they thought about, how would all of that work? And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to show them, here's how we worked all of that out.
Now, you took the family to see each other's launches and landings, which I imagine were really exciting times for the family. But did the children ever express concern or worry that there might be an accident or that you might not come home? And particularly like after the Challenger, well, your children, you only had one child at the time of the Challenger accident, but when the Columbia tragedy happened, did you have to kind of explain things to them, or did they just get it, that it was a dangerous job?
They were all old enough by the time of the Columbia accident. It was more so Challenger, and I remember Paul, our older son at the time of Challenger. He was what, 3.5? He was 3.5, and his teachers said he knew something was going on, that something had happened, and it really put him in some kind of a mood. He just turned very quiet. Mm-hmm. So he knew something had happened. He knew Mom and Dad were sad about something, but he wasn't quite old enough at that point to really understand it.
But you know, he was 2 years older when the shuttle flights began again. And Hoot was down at the Cape supporting that STS 26, 25. Anyway, the return to flight.
26.
And as it got closer and closer, I could tell Paul was nervous. He kept saying, "Is Dad on that space shuttle?" And I kept saying, "No." And so Anna Fisher, who had a young child at the time, and I went to a quiet place and watched the launch and had to reassure our children that Dad was okay. So I think they pick up on it, but you know, pretty much our lives went on as before. But I think that different ones of them had different sensitivities to, you know, to worrying about us. But you know, you handle that with all children. Children may worry that, you know, you're flying someplace else, or they don't know where you are at the time. So I think we had to handle that the way most families do.
Well, and there may be students in the audience who have parents who are first responders, or perhaps pilots, or in the military. And I imagine within your families you have some of these same concerns and ways of working through your concerns. I'd like to ask Hoot and Ray, to talk about a picture that's on the back of this book, which is of your second son, right, Dan. And let me hand you the book, and you can comment on that picture. It's a very nice story.
It's a brilliant photograph that's on the back of this book. You can guess who took the picture.
He did.
This was Rhea's second mission, and I know you can't really see it from out there where you are, but it's the Space Shuttle Columbia coming back to land at Edwards Air Force Base, and our little son Dan, who at the time was 2 years old, and he's dressed in a flight suit. He has an astronaut flight suit on, and he's watching Mom come back in and land, and I had been standing there taking pictures of the space shuttle as it was approaching, and I happened to glance over at Dan, and he was standing there and he was waving at the space shuttle as it's coming in to land. And I missed that photo because he put his arm down before I could get over there in position. But I did catch this picture
This is the shuttle.
of Dan watching his
This is
mom
this is
come
the
back
Columbia Space Shuttle.
from space. I pointed
And the-
that out already.
Okay, good.
And the picture we had on the screen earlier was of Paul in his flight suit.
That was a
right?
Paul in the flight
And then
suit.
did Emily have a flight suit
course.
too when she came along?
It got passed down.
Does a picture exist of all of you in your flight suits?
I don't think so,
Oh.
because it was one kid flight suit that got passed down
Ah.
the way you older kids pass things down to your younger siblings.
So that brings me to the last question, which is you have written a book. Was that an easy thing to do, or was that a challenge?
No, just like Hoot learning to speak Russian, I had to learn to be creative, because you have a different part of your brain that works on creative things versus technical things like I had in medicine and with NASA. So I had written down some things before I left NASA, but I had to go back and try to fill in the blanks about how did that happen or what happened there, and I would remember. It took me several years to write it, so I could go back, and I wrote it all out longhand, so I could go back and put notes in the margin, and so it took me quite a while, but I wanted to be able to tell my children what it was really like, because when you grow up, sometimes you don't ask your parents, well, how did you meet, and how did that happen, and why did we move? You don't ask those questions, and my kids had forgotten a lot of things or didn't know anything about what we were really doing when we went to Florida every year or so. So that was why I wrote the book, but I think it tells about the lives of Hoot and me and our friends and our children growing up in that era.
And who did you get to chime in from time to time and add your perspective too?
No, I really didn't. And the book is really brilliant. It really is good. And I didn't help with it at all, other than the photos. I helped process some of the photographs.
Right, we dug up old family photos to put in there, and sometimes Hoot and I remembered things a little differently about how something happened, and sometimes we had to go to NASA, to the history folks, and ask them, who was right, and sometimes he was and sometimes I was, but we tried to get it straight.
Another example of teamwork. That's
Teamwork.
great. Okay, let's take a few more questions. Did any of the space shuttles behave or respond differently from an aircraft?
From another, it says, from another.
Or from another. I'm sorry, I misread it.
Well, they pretty much were identical, and that was the aim. That was the goal of NASA, was to make them all the same, so that you wouldn't have to have really specific training on a particular shuttle. Columbia was the first one to launch, so it was a little bit different, but for the most part, they were identical.
And I should say, we have Space Shuttle Discovery in our collection. It's on display at the Udvar Hazy Center, and it, because of the Columbia and Challenger tragedies, it's the oldest of the orbiters and the ones that flew the most missions, flew the most often. So if you ever go out to our other location near Dulles Airport, you can walk around that space shuttle, and I think you'll be amazed at how large it is. We have a very patient boy here who's been waiting to ask a question.
How hot is the landing?
How hot is the landing?
Oh, maybe the approach.
Oh, the re-entry. Good question.
Gosh.
The re-entry, when we come back into Earth's atmosphere, we're going 25 times the speed of sound. We're going 17,500 miles an hour. We hit the air, and to answer your question, the air becomes 9,000 degrees in temperature. It's hot enough to melt steel. So the thermal protection, the tiles and things that are on the shuttle are what protects it from that high temperature. So yes, it's very hot outside. It looks like you're flying in a blowtorch, is what it looks like. Good question.
But inside
Very
you don't
good.
feel it at all. It just looks kind of scary outside.
And by comparison, when you drive really fast in a car, you're driving maybe 60 to 70 miles an hour. The space shuttle flew 17,000 miles an hour, so that's just almost inconceivable. Here's a question. What do you do if someone vomits in space? We always have people who like to ask these nutty questions, or not nutty questions, but these questions about going to
Sure,
the bathroom in
just the
space or getting
practical
sick in
things.
space. So what happens
Hopefully,
when somebody vomits?
Hopefully they have kept their sick sack close at hand. I never
barf
got
bag.
sick. I never got sick on any of my 5 missions. Nevertheless, I always had a barf bag in my pocket just in case.
case.
So you didn't want to be caught without your barf bag.
We actually have a couple of barf bags in the collection, and you can see one inside this mock-up of Space Shuttle crew cabin. Here, if you look into the toilet compartment, you'll see some barf bags sticking out in there, just in case. You have a question.
Yes, my name's Chris, and what does space food in a bag taste like?
Hi, what is your space food
You
taste
know, I think when the early astronauts flew, they didn't have really a bathroom, so they had to eat food that sort of was going to stay inside of them. And so it was kind of like toothpaste, and they squeezed it out, but it had, you know, protein and carbohydrates and vitamins and stuff in it, but it wasn't very tasty. And then when they got to Skylab, they had more space and they could have more regular food. And then when we got to the shuttle, they tried to make it really tasty for us because you don't want astronauts to be starving in space. And we could go and taste the space food before we flew. Some of it was dehydrated, like you might take on a camping trip that you added water to, because we had plenty of water on the shuttle. Some of it was in meal bags, like the military folks take when they're deployed out in the field, and those were very good. And we got to take some fresh food because remember the space shuttle flights were pretty short. You know, when we started out it was 3 or 4 days, and then 7 days, got up to 14 days. But we knew that there were things that would stay okay for a period of time. We got to take some fresh fruit, bananas and apples and things like that. We could take a jar of peanut butter. We tried to talk them into flying a loaf of bread, but they found that when we pulled the bread out of the bag, all the crumbs came out. So we had to figure out something else, and so instead of taking bread, we took tortillas. And not only were they good for making peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but they were fun to play with. Imagine, you know, shooting frisbees around to everybody. So we tried to make the food better and better, and it's even better on Space Station now. So we learned a lot about keeping food, heating food, what people like when they're in space. Your taste changes a little bit. So it was in a bag usually, but it tasted pretty good.
It was good.
Especially if it was spicy. They like spicy
Yes, like
foods.
spicy stuff.
Okay, here's another question. What career opportunities are there after being an astronaut?
Oh, golly. After you've been an astronaut, you can probably do anything you want to do. People seem to be somewhat impressed with astronauts, and if you have that on your resume, you can do just about anything. When I left NASA, Ray and I left NASA in 1996, I went to work as an airline pilot for Southwest Airlines. And I got to do 10 years of that, and that was a great company to work for. But astronauts typically would go to be vice presidents of Boeing, vice presidents of Lockheed Martin, and places like that. So Ray went to Vanderbilt Medical School to be the assistant chief medical officer. So after being an astronaut, you can pretty well do anything you think you'd like to do.
But I think a lot of us take what we have learned as astronauts and apply them in different fields. When I went from being an astronaut to being a medical officer at a big medical center, I remembered about how we had used teamwork and how we had checked on each other to make sure we were doing the right thing to help doctors and nurses take better care of patients. Then I formed a company that taught that at other hospitals, and you know, and then I wrote the book. So you can see that I used what I learned from one career into the next, and I think you young people will definitely have more than one career in your life, and sometimes you get laid off and you have to figure out, well, what did I learn there that might be useful over here? So you have to learn to make those transitions in your life.
And both of you also do public speaking at schools and conferences,
Right.
Motivational speeches on leadership and teamwork, and so you're putting all that to use too.
Sure.
I think we have one last question here.
Hi, my name is Tiffany, and what was the most hardest thing being an astronaut?
The hardest thing about it.
I guess the hardest thing about it is getting selected in the first place, probably. Yeah, as Ray mentioned, you had to have a college degree in either engineering, science, or mathematics, or be a teacher. So you had to have that background. And there's a lot of people that want to do it. So there were 8,000 people that were qualified applications when we got selected, and they only picked 35 people. So the odds are kind of against you. So you would say, okay, gee, the odds are against me, but at the same time, they got to pick somebody, and it might as well be you. So that's the other way to look at it.
Definitely worth trying.
And knowing your job really well when you get up there, because a lot of people are watching you when you're in space.
Well, and I've often heard astronauts say that after all of that training, the thing they worry about the most when they are in space is making a mistake, messing up, being responsible for the mission not being 100% successful. So I think every one of them bears a lot of responsibility to do their part to make sure it succeeds. And it's very rare that anybody does make a mistake. This has been a fascinating program. I'm just delighted that we had this opportunity to talk with Captain Hoot Gibson and Dr. Rhea Seddon, and to have such a lively group of students with us and so many interested people online. Again, I'd like to thank the Boeing Company, which generously sponsors these programs, and I'd like to remind our local audience that Dr. Seddon will be doing a book signing right outside the gallery in just a few minutes. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook or the webcast, this book is available online as well. You can find it via Amazon or other sellers, and it may well be in your neighborhood bookstore. It's called Go for Orbit. A female astronaut or a woman astronaut finds her space. And it really is an excellent read with a lot of the kinds of topics included that we've talked about today. Will you join me in thanking our guests?